The pool was supposed to be Marcus Webb's sanctuary. Instead, it had become his obsession, not the good kind. The kind that kept him awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling of his master bedroom in the Oak Ridge Estates community, listening to distant laughter echoing over his back fence. He'd built this place from nothing. 32 years of climbing, from a kid in a rent-controlled apartment where his mother worked 3 jobs, to a senior software engineer at one of Silicon Valley's most exclusive firms. The house on Cypress Ridge Drive represented every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment he'd chosen ambition over everything else. The pool had cost $42,000, not that he was counting anymore. He'd stopped counting somewhere around month 4 of the intrusions. It started in late June. Marcus noticed it first from his home office window, a flash of movement in the backyard, a teenager mid-backstroke moving through his water like he owned it. Marcus stood frozen, his coffee going cold in his hand. Through the window, he could see the kids' friends lounging on his deck chairs. Someone had brought a speaker. Music thumped across the fence line from the neighboring property. The house next door belonged to the Hendersons, a family of 5 that moved in almost exactly a year ago. The mother, Victoria Henderson, had introduced herself once at the mailbox with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was the kind of beautiful that came from expensive maintenance. Blonde hair that never seemed to need touching up, designer athleisure that probably cost more than Marcus's first car, a wedding ring that caught the light like a small sun. Marcus had learned to recognize her type in Silicon Valley. Married to money, professionally bored, perpetually hunting for something to complain about. He'd nodded politely, made small talk about the neighborhood, and retreated into his life. That had been sufficient. Until it wasn't. He went downstairs and opened the back door. The sound hit him first, actual laughter, the kind that comes from people completely at ease. 4 teenagers, maybe 5. A girl was doing cannonballs while 2 boys cheered from the deep end. On the deck, under the umbrella Marcus had bought specifically to sit under while reading technical documentation, Victoria Henderson sat with a glass of something pale and fizzy, her eyes closed, her face tilted toward the sun like it was made of money. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, trying for friendly and landing somewhere between confused and irritated. Victoria's eyes snapped open. She looked at him for a moment, actually looked, like she was assessing a piece of furniture she'd seen at a store and was considering whether to buy it. "Hi there," she said finally, with the brightness of someone greeting a dog that had wandered into her yard. "The kids wanted to cool off. Your pool is right there and you're not using it. We thought, why not?" The statement hung in the air like a physical thing, aggressive in its casual entitlement. "It's my pool," Marcus said. The words felt ridiculous even as they left his mouth. Of course it was his pool. The title was in his name. "I know," Victoria said, not bothering to stand up. "That's why you could just say yes. It would be so easy." One of the teenagers, the girl doing cannonballs, looked between them with the discomfort of someone realizing they'd wandered into a conflict. The other kids noticed the temperature drop. The splashing slowed. "I'd prefer that you didn't use it," Marcus said carefully. "I need to respect the rules of the HOA, liability issues." "Please," Victoria actually waved her hand dismissively. "The Henderson family is half the social committee for the HOA. We know the rules better than anyone. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. And that was the moment Marcus learned the first important lesson about people like Victoria Henderson. When someone that comfortable in their own privilege tells you something is fine, what they're actually telling you is that they don't care what you think about it. He went back inside and stood at the sink, gripping the edge. Through the kitchen window, he could hear them resume their celebration. Someone turned the speaker louder. They were playing music now, something with a heavy bass that vibrated through the walls of his house. His house. That night he lay in bed and couldn't sleep. He got up at 1 a.m. and stood at his window, watching. The kids were gone, but the lights remained on in his pool. Victoria and another woman, probably her sister or best friend, floated on inflatable loungers, their voices carrying across the still neighborhood air. They were talking about the summer, about a vacation, about something someone's husband had supposedly done at some club in San Francisco. They looked so happy. Marcus stood there for 45 minutes. By the time he finally went to bed, he'd made a decision. If they wouldn't respect boundaries, he would make boundaries impossible to ignore. The next morning, Marcus went to the HOA office in the community center, a beige room with beige furniture that smelled like industrial coffee and broken dreams. There was a woman behind the desk named Sandra who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the exhausted expression of someone who spent their days managing other people's property disputes. "I need to file a complaint," Marcus said. Sandra looked up with the enthusiasm of a person asked to voluntarily stub their toe. "About what?" she asked. "The neighbors are using my pool without permission." "The Henderson family?" Sandra was already nodding like she knew exactly what was coming. "Yeah, Victoria mentioned they'd been enjoying it." "They don't have my permission." "Well," Sandra said, clicking her pen 3 times, "the HOA rules do state that common recreational amenities are meant to be used responsibly by all community members, if they live in the community." "It's not a common amenity," Marcus interrupted. "It's on my property, in my backyard, it's private." "Yes, but there's a certain spirit of community here in Oak Ridge. The HOA prides itself on maintaining a friendly, welcoming environment for families." Sandra was reading from a script now, he could tell. She'd definitely given this speech before. "Perhaps you could work it out with the Hendersons directly, maybe establish some designated times when they could use the facility." "I don't want them using it at all." "Oh," Sandra set down her pen. She looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Well, that's going to be a problem because Victoria is quite influential in our community, very involved, and Mr. Henderson is a significant donor to our annual events. So." The "so" hung there loaded with implication. "So you're one person, they're connected, so good luck." Marcus walked out of that office feeling something he rarely felt: powerless. He spent that afternoon researching privacy laws, property rights, HOA regulations. He read through forums where other homeowners complained about boundary violations. Most of them ended the same way: the person being violated learned to accept it or they moved. Neither option was acceptable to Marcus Webb. He ordered the cameras that evening, a high-end system with 4K resolution, night vision, and cloud storage. 2 cameras for the back gate, 1 for the pool area itself, 1 for his garage to catch anyone entering his property. Professional-grade equipment, the kind of thing that would have seemed paranoid to buy for any normal situation. But this wasn't normal anymore. This was violation dressed up as friendliness. The cameras arrived 2 days later. Marcus installed them himself on a Saturday afternoon, climbing ladders, running wires through corners, configuring the system on his phone. He set them to record continuously, with higher sensitivity to motion between 6 p.m. and midnight. When he was finished, he stood in his backyard and looked at the small black boxes positioned on the corners of his house. They looked exactly like what they were: surveillance, accountability, evidence. It felt good. It also felt like the beginning of something he couldn't quite name yet, something that would spiral in directions he couldn't predict. That night, the Hendersons didn't come. Or rather, their kids did, but only once, and they left quickly when they noticed Marcus watching from the kitchen window. Victoria didn't show up until the following Wednesday evening with 3 friends and a bottle of wine. They spent 2 hours in the pool, laughing, talking about someone named Derek who apparently had broken someone's heart at Tahoe. Marcus watched from his home office, his phone open to the camera feed. He recorded everything, every frame, every laugh, every moment of casual entitlement. By the end of that first week, he had accumulated hours of footage. By the end of the second week, he'd started cataloging it. Times, dates, duration of visits, number of people, what they were drinking, what they were wearing, names when he could catch them being called out across the water. By the end of the third week, his world had become very small. Just him and the cameras and the undeniable evidence that the Hendersons and their extended social circle considered his pool to be a public amenity. And then something shifted. He was sitting in his office on a Thursday evening when he noticed something different in the footage. Victoria had arrived, yes, but she wasn't alone. She had her husband with her, a man Marcus recognized from the occasional neighborhood gathering, tall, tanned, wearing the kind of casual confidence that came from being born into money. They entered the pool area at 9:15 p.m. The kids must have been asleep at home because Victoria had come with just her husband and another couple, people Marcus had never seen before. The footage showed them settling into the water. Then the other couple got out and went inside Marcus's house. Just walked through the gate, up the patio steps, and through the sliding glass door that opened into his home office. Marcus's chest went cold. They were inside, in his house, without permission, while he stood 10 feet away on the other side of a wall. His hands moved before his mind could catch up. He jerked his office door open and walked through the hallway, his heart hitting hard against his ribs. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of laughter coming from the backyard and the mechanical hum of his air conditioning. He checked every room. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing appeared to be missing, but that wasn't the point. The point was the violation, the casual, absolute violation of it. When he went back to his office, he watched the timestamp on the camera footage. They'd been inside for exactly 4 minutes. The couple emerged back onto the patio, went to the pool, and settled in beside Victoria and her husband. 4 minutes inside Marcus Webb's house. He sat there for a long time watching the camera feed. He watched them float on the water. He watched them laugh about something. He watched them, and something hard and cold began to crystallize in his chest, something that felt like purpose. They had made a mistake. They'd crossed from using something that was his to actually entering somewhere that was his. They'd given him something he could point to, something undeniable. Marcus pulled out his phone and began to document everything. He created a folder. He named it Evidence. He started making screenshots, timestamps, notes. By the time the Hendersons and their friends finally left the pool at 11:47 p.m., Marcus had filled 20 pages of notes, all neatly dated and organized. He still didn't know exactly what he was going to do with any of it, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this go. The turning point came on a Saturday morning in mid-August when Victoria Henderson showed up at Marcus's door. She didn't knock. She rang the doorbell 3 times in quick succession, the kind of insistent ringing that suggested someone who'd never been made to wait for anything in her life. Marcus was in his home gym doing push-ups when he heard it. He grabbed a towel, wiped his face, and took his time walking to the door. When he opened it, Victoria was standing there in designer workout clothes, her hair in a perfect ponytail, her expression a mixture of irritation and something that might have been concern. "Hi," she said before he could say anything. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Okay," Marcus said, neither opening the door wider nor closing it. "The kids have been asking if they can have their birthday parties here. Both birthdays are in September, and they thought maybe you could let them use the pool for a few hours. We'd provide everything, food, decorations, drinks. You wouldn't have to do anything. We'd actually make it easier for you." Marcus stared at her. He genuinely couldn't tell if she was joking. "No," he said. "I'm sorry. No, the answer is no. Your children cannot have their birthday parties at my house in my pool." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're being unreasonable." "I'm being clear," Marcus said. "I've asked you and your family multiple times to stop using my pool. You've ignored those requests. The answer to all future requests is no. I'm not a community resource. This is my property." "You know what?" Victoria said, her voice taking on that particular tone that sounds like a threat wrapped in pleasantness. "We were trying to be nice. We thought you might want to be part of the neighborhood community. Turns out you're just another selfish tech guy who moved into a neighborhood he doesn't understand." "I understand it perfectly," Marcus said. "I understand that you think everyone's property is yours to use as you see fit. That's what I understand." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, not a real smile, something sharp and calculated. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly. She turned and walked back to her car without waiting for a response. That night, Marcus reviewed all his camera footage. He spent 3 hours cataloging everything, every visit from June onward. He created a spreadsheet, dates, times, duration, names of people involved, whether alcohol was present, whether anyone entered his house. He documented it all with the precision of someone writing a legal brief. By midnight, he had a comprehensive record of 63 separate violations spanning 6 weeks. He sat back in his desk chair and stared at the spreadsheet. The numbers felt powerful. The data felt irrefutable. But he still didn't know what to do with it. The answer came from an unexpected place. He was at work on Monday in a meeting with his development team about a legacy code issue when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. He was in a meeting, but the person texted again. And again, 3 messages in a row. During a break, he checked them. "Hi, Marcus, this is Janice from Oak Ridge HOA. I was given your contact information by Victoria Henderson. We should discuss your recent complaints. The HOA has received multiple complaints from multiple neighbors about your hostile behavior. Please call me at your earliest convenience to discuss this matter. Marcus called her immediately. Janice turned out to be the actual president of the HOA, not the exhausted receptionist he'd spoken with before. Her voice was measured and professional in a way that suggested she'd learned to navigate these situations by taking no one's side until she absolutely had to. Mr. Webb, she began, we have a situation that needs to be resolved. Victoria Henderson has filed a formal complaint alleging that you've been hostile to her and her family. She says you've been recording them on your property, which falls under surveillance that could violate community privacy standards. She's also questioning whether your hostility might constitute harassment. She's trespassing on my property, Marcus said flatly. Multiple times a day for the past 6 weeks. I have documentation of every incident. I have footage of her entering my house without permission. She said you invited her family to use the pool, Janice said carefully. I never invited anyone to use my pool. That's not what Victoria told the board. There it was, that was the moment Marcus understood the real problem. It wasn't about what actually happened. It was about who the Henderson family was in this community, connected, social, financially comfortable. They had currency. They had standing. And he was someone who'd complained to the wrong person initially. I need you to understand something, Janice continued, and now her voice had taken on a tone of actual kindness, which was somehow worse. The Oak Ridge community prides itself on being inclusive and friendly. The Henderson family feels very much a part of that. They're concerned about your behavior pattern toward them. If you want to resolve this situation peacefully, I'd suggest you might consider a compromise, perhaps allowing them limited access to your pool during certain hours, or... No, Marcus said. I've already said no, I'll say no again, and I'm not being hostile. I'm establishing boundaries. If that offends people, then they're the problem, not me. Mr. Webb. He hung up. He sat at his desk for 10 minutes without moving. Around him, the office hummed with the sound of dozens of conversations, lines of code being written, problems being solved. Everyone here understood systems, logic, data. If you had evidence, if you had documentation, you could prove your case. That's what he'd believed about life outside of work, too. That if you were right and you could prove it, the truth would matter. He was beginning to understand that life outside of work didn't work that way. That evening, Marcus went back to his footage. But this time, he wasn't just cataloging. He was editing. He put together a video, 15 minutes of the most egregious violations. The nighttime pool parties, the family entering his house, the casual presumption. He added text overlays with timestamps and dates. He set it to music. By the time he was finished, it told a very clear story. He was being violated repeatedly, and it was all documented. He considered uploading it to YouTube, maybe social media, maybe the Nextdoor app that the neighborhood used to discuss community issues. He didn't, but he thought about it. He saved the video to his computer and looked at it 3 times that week. It made him feel powerful. It made him feel like he had proof, like proof meant something. Then on the following Friday, he got a different kind of message. Not a text this time, but an actual letter, delivered to his mailbox by certified mail. It was from Victoria and Derek Henderson's attorney. The letter was brief and to the point. They were requesting that Marcus remove all surveillance equipment from his property immediately. They were alleging that he was using the cameras to monitor and record them without consent, which violated California privacy law. They claimed his intent was to harass and intimidate their family. They were requesting that he cease and desist from recording any footage that captured their property, their family members, or anyone visiting their home. If he failed to comply within 10 days, they would pursue legal action to force compliance and would seek damages for emotional distress and violation of privacy. Marcus read it 3 times, sitting in his car in his driveway, the envelope open in his hands. His cameras were positioned on his own house, pointing at his own property. Everything they'd recorded was happening on his own deck, in his own pool, sometimes even inside his own home. That should matter. That should be completely legal. But he called a lawyer anyway. He couldn't help himself. The lawyer, a man named Robert Chen who worked in residential property law, listened to the entire story without interrupting. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Here's your situation," Robert said finally. The camera's on your own property, pointed at your own property. That's completely legal. California law allows you to record on your own property. Where it gets complicated is if your cameras are capturing audio, or if you're recording private moments, or if the cameras are angled in a way that captures their property beyond what a reasonable person would expect. They're using my pool, Marcus said. They're entering my house. Shouldn't that be a trespass issue? It's complicated, Robert said again, and Marcus was beginning to hate that phrase. If they had permission at any point, even implied permission, then it becomes a civil matter rather than a trespass. The HOA has already indicated there's disagreement about whether they had permission. You said no repeatedly. They apparently said you invited them. Neither of you has written documentation either way, so a judge would have to make a determination based on credibility. I have video evidence showing them using my pool without asking me. You have video evidence of them using your pool. That doesn't prove you didn't give permission. And here's the thing, Marcus, and I say this as someone trying to help you, going to court over this is going to be expensive and exhausting. You'll spend tens of thousands of dollars. The case will probably settle somewhere in the middle. And in the meantime, you'll be fighting with these people for months, possibly years. So what do I do? You could remove the cameras, comply with their cease and desist, and move forward. Let it go. I'm not letting it go, Marcus said. I shouldn't have to let it go. I shouldn't have to accept this violation. Then you're in for a fight, Robert said quietly. And I'd recommend you think very carefully about whether this is the fight you want to have. After Marcus hung up, he sat in his car for a long time. Through the garage window, he could see his house, his pool, his property. He thought about what Robert had said, tens of thousands of dollars, months of fighting, probably ending in some kind of compromise anyway. The reasonable thing would be to just let it go. But reasonableness had never been Marcus's strength. Persistence was, the ability to identify a problem and solve it systematically. The refusal to back down once he decided he was right about something. On Saturday morning, instead of removing the cameras, Marcus upgraded the system. He added 2 more cameras to ensure complete coverage. He increased the storage capacity. He enabled alerts to his phone whenever motion was detected in his backyard. He wasn't going to let it go. He was going to gather more evidence. He was going to document everything. He was going to win. It was on a Tuesday night that he saw something that changed everything. He was in bed, half asleep, when his phone buzzed with a motion alert. 11:47 p.m. He opened the camera feed. It was the backyard, multiple figures. He sat up fully now, scrolling through the video. The Hendersons had thrown a party. There were cars lining the street. Through the front gate, he could see 15, maybe 20 people moving through the backyard. They'd brought their own sound system. The bass was so loud it was causing vibrations he could feel in his bedroom. Colored lights had been strung across the pool deck. Someone had erected a tent. It looked like a professional event setup. They'd turned his property into a venue. Marcus got out of bed without thinking. He walked to his backyard window and looked out. From there, he could see the glow of the lights, hear the music, see silhouettes of people moving and dancing. They were using his pool, his deck, his property, and they were hosting what appeared to be a full-scale event. The recording timestamp said 11:54 p.m. He watched for 4 minutes, then he went downstairs and outside. He stood at the back gate, watching. No one noticed him at first. He was just a shadow in the darkness, on his own property, watching people party in his pool. Then one of the teenagers saw him and nudged a friend. The friend nudged another person. Slowly, the music didn't stop, but the dancing slowed. People noticed the man in a t-shirt standing in the darkness, watching them like some kind of phantom. Victoria noticed last. She was floating on an inflatable in the deep end, a cocktail in her hand. When she saw Marcus, she waved, actually waved, like he'd arrived to join them. "Marcus," she called out, "come on in, we're celebrating Derek's promotion." "Get off my property," he said quietly. "What?" Victoria cupped her ear. "I can't hear you." He said it louder this time, loud enough that his voice cut through the music, through the laughter, through all of it. "Get off my property." The music stopped. Someone had turned it off. Now there was just the sound of water, of crickets, of someone's nervous laugh that nobody else joined. "Wow," Victoria said, and she sounded genuinely surprised, like she'd just discovered that people could actually say no to her. "Wow, okay, Derek, he's not going to." "Everyone out," Marcus said. "Now, or I'm calling the police." He turned and walked back inside his house. He went directly to his office, sat down at his computer, and called the police non-emergency line. He reported a trespassing situation. He reported that he'd repeatedly asked individuals to leave his property and they'd refused. He provided his address. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in immediate danger. Marcus said no. In that case, we can send an officer, but response time might be 30 minutes to an hour. Are you in a safe location? Yes, Marcus said. Okay, we'll dispatch someone. Try to remain calm. If anyone threatens you or the situation escalates, hang up and call 911. He hung up and sat in the darkness of his office, listening to the sound of panic on his deck. People were scrambling now, gathering their things, arguing about something. Car doors slammed. The music system was being hastily disassembled. Someone yelled about the cops being called. Through the camera feed on his phone, Marcus watched it all. He watched Victoria standing in the pool, no longer floating or smiling, arguing with her husband. He watched Derek grab her arm, trying to pull her out of the water. He watched the carefully constructed evening collapse into chaos. The police showed up 42 minutes later. Officer Ramirez was a woman in her mid-40s with the tired expression of someone who'd responded to thousands of neighborhood disputes and had learned to be impressed by none of them. She took Marcus's statement, then went to speak with Victoria and Derek, who'd already moved everyone off the property. Marcus watched from his window as Victoria gesticulated, as Derek spoke in low tones, as Officer Ramirez took notes and nodded without expression. 20 minutes later, the officer came to Marcus's front door. So here's the situation, Officer Ramirez said without preamble. The neighbors claim they had your permission to use the pool. They say this is an ongoing arrangement. You say that's not true. Without a clear criminal act or evidence of actual trespass, this is a civil matter. What I can tell you is that you have the right to refuse anyone access to your property, and if they continue to use it after being asked to leave, that would constitute trespass. I've asked them to leave repeatedly, Marcus said. Okay, so going forward, if they continue to use your property without permission, you can contact the police and report it. But for tonight, there's no crime that I can cite them for. I've advised them that you don't want them on your property and that further violation could result in charges. That's what I can do. That's it. That's it, Officer Ramirez said. Unless you want to pursue a civil restraining order, which is a different process. After she left, Marcus stood in his kitchen and felt something he couldn't quite name. Vindication, partially, but also something else. Something that felt like the beginning of something larger and more complicated. He'd called the police. He'd made the Hendersons leave his property. He'd established that he had the right to refuse them access. But he also understood that this was only the first move in what was going to be a much longer game. The next morning, he received another certified letter. This one was from the Hendersons' attorney, and it was more aggressive. They were now stating that Marcus had harassed and endangered their family by calling the police on them during a private event. They were requesting $50,000 in damages. They were also filing a formal complaint with the HOA about his aggressive and hostile behavior, and requesting that he be fined or, preferably, required to sell his house and leave the community. Marcus read it while sitting at his kitchen counter, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. He'd wanted consequences for the Hendersons. He'd documented everything, gathered evidence, and taken action. He'd succeeded. They were now experiencing consequences. But the consequences were coming back to him, and they were escalating. By September, the Oak Ridge community had split almost exactly in half, a fracture that would eventually destroy the carefully maintained facade of neighborly peace that the HOA spent so much time cultivating. On one side, the Hendersons and their considerable social network. Derek Henderson had donated over $50,000 to the community in the past year. Victoria sat on the social committee and organized the annual summer block party. They were visible, engaged, and had spent the last 10 years building relationships with nearly everyone in the neighborhood. Their story was simple and sympathetic. An unhinged neighbor was harassing them, recording them without consent, and making their family feel unsafe. On the other side, Marcus Webb and a handful of people who believed in property rights, boundaries, and rules. Most of them came from tech backgrounds, people who understood systems and codes and understood that if you let one person violate boundaries with impunity, the entire system collapsed. They didn't particularly like Marcus, but they agreed that he was right about this. The rest of the community, probably 80% of the neighborhood, had simply tuned it out. They didn't want to get involved. They wanted to enjoy their September morning coffee without having to pick sides in a property dispute. The HOA was not among those who could ignore it. Janice called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, and Marcus attended, bringing Robert Chen with him. They sat in the Oak Ridge Community Center at a long wooden table under fluorescent lights, with 12 board members ranging from sympathetic to actively hostile. Victoria was there too, but she was smart enough to have her attorney present, a woman named Susan Price who wore tailored suits and had the expression of someone who believed that money could solve any problem. "Let's be clear about what we're discussing," Susan began before anyone else could speak. "My clients are being harassed by their neighbor. They are being recorded without consent. They are being subjected to police interventions for perfectly innocent neighborhood socializing. They are being defamed in the community. And the HOA, which exists to maintain property values and community standards, is allowing this to continue. That's what we're discussing." "We're also discussing trespassing," Robert said calmly. "My client's documented evidence shows repeated unauthorized use of his private property. He's asked repeatedly for it to stop. It hasn't. He's employed legal means to establish boundaries." "He's called the police on children," Susan said, and her voice had turned sharp. "He's surveilled our client's family. He's made them feel unsafe in their own community. That's not establishing boundaries. That's harassment." "He has a right to privacy and security on his own property," Robert said. "He has a right to refuse access. That's not harassment. That's property rights." Back and forth they went, and Marcus could see the board members' eyes glazing over. This wasn't what they'd signed up for when they agreed to volunteer for the HOA. They wanted to discuss landscaping standards and roof materials and community events. They didn't want to referee philosophical debates about property rights and harassment. Finally, Janice spoke up. "Gentlemen, Ms. Price, let's focus on what the HOA can actually do here. Mr. Webb, the board would like to request that you remove the surveillance cameras from your property. Many homeowners are uncomfortable with the surveillance precedent." "The cameras are legal," Robert interrupted. "Mr. Webb can install whatever security measures he wants on his own property. The HOA has no authority to force their removal." "Perhaps," Janice said carefully, "but the spirit of the community is." "I don't care about the spirit of the community," Marcus said. It was the first thing he'd said during the entire meeting, and it landed like a stone in water. "The spirit of the community stole from me for 6 weeks. The spirit of the community used my property without permission. The spirit of the community laughed at me when I asked them to stop. The cameras are staying." Susan smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just been given exactly what she needed. "Your Honor," she said, then corrected herself with a practiced laugh. "Sorry, force of habit. Your Honor would be the judge. But for the purposes of this board, I think Mr. Webb's comment actually illustrates the hostility we're concerned about. He views this community as a threat. He views his neighbors as thieves. That's not a healthy attitude in a residential community." "What I said was fact," Marcus said. "They did use my property without permission." "They say you invited them," Susan countered. "They're lying." "So it comes down to credibility," Susan said. "And here's what the board needs to understand. My clients are offering to settle this amicably. They're offering to never use the pool again. They're offering to refund any damages Mr. Webb feels he's incurred. In exchange, Mr. Webb removes the cameras and agrees to a peace bond, essentially an agreement to not engage in further harassment." "That's a false equivalence," Robert said. "My client hasn't harassed anyone. He's protected his property and defended his rights." "His rights don't extend to surveillance and police harassment," Susan said. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand. He was looking at Janice and the board members. He could read their body language. They wanted this to go away. They wanted him to take the settlement and remove the cameras and make everyone's lives easier. "No," Marcus said simply. Susan's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. "I think you should reconsider," she said. "There's nothing to reconsider," Marcus said. "They violated my boundaries. I documented it. I stopped it. The cameras stay, and I'm not signing anything." The meeting ended 15 minutes later without resolution. As Marcus was packing up his things, Janice pulled him aside. "You should have taken the settlement," she said quietly. "You should have taken it and moved on with your life." "Why?" Marcus asked. "I didn't do anything wrong." "No," Janice agreed. "But sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes being right just makes other people more determined to prove you're wrong." It was a warning. Marcus recognized it as such, but he was beyond the point where warnings mattered. That week, he received a letter from the HOA. They were fining him $2,000 for violating community rules about surveillance equipment. They were also requesting that he remove the cameras within 14 days. If he refused, he would be fined an additional $500 per day until the cameras were removed. "This is harassment," Robert said when Marcus called him. "This is retaliation for standing up for your rights. We can fight this." "How much will it cost?" Marcus asked. "To file a countersuit against the HOA, hire me full-time, and go through the appeals process. Probably 15, 20,000 minimum. Maybe more depending on how far it goes." Marcus had been prepared to spend money to defend his position. He had savings. He had a good salary, but $15,000 to $20,000 on top of legal fees for the original dispute. This was starting to add up to something real. "I'll think about it," Marcus said. He didn't have to think about it for long. 3 days later, he received a notice of foreclosure action. The HOA, the letter explained, had the authority to place a lien on his property for unpaid fines. Since he hadn't paid the initial $2,000 or complied with their removal order, they were initiating legal action to force compliance and recover the fees through foreclosure if necessary. It was a nuclear option, and it was being deployed without hesitation. "This is insane," Marcus said to Robert over the phone. "They can't foreclose on my house for $2,000. "Technically, they can," Robert said. "It's rare, but they have the authority. What's happening here is escalation. They're trying to force you to back down by making this more expensive and complicated than any reasonable person would accept." "So what do I do?" "You pay the fine," Robert said. "You remove the cameras, you de-escalate." "No," Marcus said. "I'm not giving in. I'll pay the fine, that's fine, but the cameras stay." "Then you're in for a very expensive, very protracted legal battle," Robert said. "And I don't know if I can recommend that you take that course of action." Marcus paid the fine on the following Monday. $2,000 transferred to the HOA via wire with a memo line, "Under protest." The cameras did not come down. What happened next was a slow burn that seemed to involve nearly everyone in the community. There were whispered conversations at the mailbox. There were social media posts, never naming Marcus directly, but making references to certain neighbors who were destroying the community spirit. There were emails on the neighborhood next-door page. There was a petition that the Hendersons circulated, asking for the HOA to enforce community standards and asking Marcus to either comply with removal orders or agree to sell his property to an interested buyer. The petition got 53 signatures, more than half the neighborhood. Marcus didn't go to the HOA meetings anymore. He didn't engage with the community. He went to work, came home, checked his camera feeds, and documented whatever happened on his property. It had become an obsession now, but a different kind. He wasn't gathering evidence for a purpose anymore. He was gathering evidence because gathering evidence was what he did, and stopping would feel like losing. In mid-October, Derek Henderson started photographing the cameras. He'd stand at the fence line with his phone, taking pictures of the surveillance equipment. He'd post them on the HOA message board with captions like, "This is what our friendly community has become," or "Is this the Oak Ridge we want for our families?" Marcus started photographing Derek, photographing the cameras, creating a recursive loop of documentation that felt absurd and necessary at the same time. The Hendersons also filed their own restraining order, claiming that Marcus was surveilling them and that they felt threatened by his behavior. The judge who heard the case seemed uncomfortable with it. He denied the request, but with language that was clearly meant to be conciliatory. "While the evidence suggests that Mr. Webb has the legal right to install cameras on his own property, I encourage all parties to seek mediation and attempt to resolve this matter amicably." Amicably, that word again, as if hostility could simply be turned into pleasantness through sheer willpower. It was late October when something new happened. Marcus came home from work to find someone had spray-painted "Surveillance Freak" on the side of his garage. The paint was already drying, red letters that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. Then he called Robert. "This is vandalism," Robert said immediately. "We report this to the police, document it, photograph it. This is criminal activity. This is evidence of the harassment campaign being waged against you." Marcus reported it to the police. Officer Ramirez showed up, the same officer from the first incident. She took a photograph with her phone, wrote a report number in her citation book, and gave it to Marcus. "Do you have any idea who did this?" she asked. "No," Marcus said, "but I have cameras." He pulled up the footage on his phone. It was there, clear as day, 4:37 p.m., a teenager in a Henderson family t-shirt painting the words. Another kid filming it on his phone. Officer Ramirez watched the footage without expression. "I'll need a copy of this," she said finally. "I'll send it to you," Marcus said. "Can you arrest them?" "They're minors," Officer Ramirez said carefully. "I can report this to juvenile services, but it's not going to result in jail time. What I can tell you is that you have the legal right to press charges, and their parents would be notified. But vandalism involving minors often results in restorative justice programs rather than criminal prosecution." "So nothing happens," Marcus said. "Something happens," Officer Ramirez said. "A record is created. Their parents are notified. There might be community service. But you're right that it's not the same as an adult facing charges. That's just the reality of juvenile law." After Officer Ramirez left, Marcus looked at the spray paint on his garage again. He could have it removed. It would probably cost a few $100s, but instead he left it there. He photographed it. He added it to his documentation. 2 days later, his mailbox was destroyed, kicked in, the door hanging off its hinges. He photographed it. He called the police. He documented the incident. The next day, someone threw a rock through his back window, the one in his home office, where his cameras stored their footage. This time, Officer Ramirez didn't come. A different officer showed up, Officer Martinez, a man who seemed annoyed to be there at all. "Do you have any idea who's doing this?" he asked. "I can probably guess," Marcus said, "but I have cameras." "Did the cameras capture this?" Officer Martinez interrupted. "The window that was broken is where the recording equipment is stored. So no, not directly, but other cameras should have footage of whoever threw the rock." Marcus pulled up the footage. It was grainy, recorded at a distance, but you could make out a figure in the darkness. It might have been the Hendersons' oldest son. It might have been someone else. "Hard to tell who that is from this footage," Officer Martinez said. "And I'm not going to cite a teenager based on unclear video. If you see anything more concrete, call back." He left. The window didn't get fixed that day. It wasn't until the next morning that Marcus hired a glass company to replace it, at a cost of nearly $2,000. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by the cameras that had been supposed to protect him, and understood with sudden, perfect clarity that he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in installing the cameras. That had been the right call. The mistake was in believing that being right meant he would win. In believing that evidence mattered, in believing that systems worked the way they were supposed to. The mistake was in thinking that documenting violations would stop them, instead of just giving him a better view of how thoroughly he was losing. November came to Oak Ridge like a punishment. Marcus had stopped going to the neighborhood coffee shop. He'd stopped leaving his house except for work. He had his groceries delivered. He hired a service to maintain the yard. He became a ghost in his own neighborhood, visible only through the camera feeds that documented the deterioration of his property and his life. The vandalism had become a near-daily occurrence. His trash cans were knocked over and scattered. His mailbox was repeatedly destroyed, so he stopped checking it and instead got mail forwarded to his office. Someone painted another slur on his driveway, this one visible to anyone passing by. Someone else slashed his car's tires and left them in his front yard arranged to spell leave. Each incident was documented on camera. Each incident he reported to the police. Each incident resulted in a report number and a police officer's sympathetic expression and nothing else. "You need to consider moving," Robert said during one of their increasingly frequent phone calls. "I'm serious. This is escalating in a direction that's not going to end well for you." "I'm not leaving my own house because of these people," Marcus said. "You're leaving your own house because you're not safe there," Robert countered. That's the real situation. You have a right to the property legally, but you don't have a right to safety if you stay, and I think that matters more than principle at this point. Marcus didn't respond. They both knew he wasn't going to move. Moving would be admitting defeat. Moving would be admitting that everything he'd done, all the documentation, all the evidence, all the careful cataloging of violations, had been pointless. It was a Friday when the actual breaking point came. He was at work when his alarm system went off. His phone buzzed with a motion detection alert. His front door camera showed someone on his porch. He clicked on the feed. It was Victoria Henderson, standing at his front door with what looked like papers in her hand. He called the police before doing anything else. By the time Victoria left, he'd explained the situation to a dispatcher who'd taken a report about a potential threat. Then he called Robert. "She delivered something," Marcus said. "I think it's legal documents." It was, when he got home, an hour later after the police had cleared the scene, there was an envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a new lawsuit. The Hendersons were suing him for emotional distress, harassment, violation of privacy, and something called negligent infliction of emotional trauma. They were seeking $200,000 in damages. $200,000. Marcus sat on his front steps and read through the complaint carefully, his hands shaking. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. They were going to bury him in legal fees. They were going to make it so expensive to defend himself that he'd eventually give up and settle, just to make it stop. He looked at the amount again, $200,000. That was his down payment for the house. That was his security. That was the physical manifestation of everything he'd worked for being extracted from his bank account, given to the people who'd violated his boundaries in the first place. He called Robert. "This is a strategic move," Robert said after listening to the details. "They know you'll have to hire me again. They know legal fees are going to be significant. They're hoping you'll settle for a fraction of that amount just to make it stop." "How much will it cost me to defend myself against this?" Marcus asked. "Depends on how litigious they want to be, but probably $30,000 to $50,000 minimum. Maybe more." Marcus did the math. Legal fees for the defense, the original dispute, repairs to his property, the window, the vandalism repair. He was looking at probably $75,000 already spent, and they were now filing for $200,000. "We can countersue for malicious prosecution," Robert was saying. "We can argue that the lawsuit is frivolous and designed solely to harass. We can." "I'm tired," Marcus said quietly. "I know," Robert said, "but giving up now is the worst time to give up. You'd be giving up when you're closest to actually winning the legal argument." "Am I?" Marcus asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I'm losing everything. I'm losing my house. I'm losing my savings. I'm losing my neighborhood. I'm losing my peace of mind. And for what? So I can be technically right about property law." "You're stressed," Robert said. "This is understandable, but you need to not make any decisions right now. Sleep on it. We'll talk on Monday." Marcus hung up and sat on his front steps as the sun went down. Through the speakers mounted on his house, he could hear music coming from the Henderson property. They were having another party. He could see lights strung across their deck, could see silhouettes moving behind lit windows. He pulled out his phone and opened the camera feed. It was automatic now, like checking his pulse. The feed showed the same thing, the Hendersons hosting another event, laughing with friends, living their lives while his fell apart. All because they'd wanted to use his pool. All because he'd said no. He understood now, with a clarity that felt like being struck by lightning, that there was no winning scenario here. Not really. Even if he beat them in court, even if he proved his case conclusively, even if he won the $200,000 countersuit, he'd still be the guy who fought with his neighbors. He'd still be the guy who destroyed community spirit. He'd still be the guy living next to people who hated him, in a neighborhood that had turned against him. Being right didn't matter. Justice didn't matter. All that mattered was that he'd crossed the Hendersons, and the Hendersons had resources, connections, and absolutely no qualms about using both to destroy him. He went inside and sat at his computer. The cameras were still recording. The documentation was still accumulating. He had months and months of evidence that nobody cared about. He opened the video file he'd created, the one he'd edited months ago and never posted. The 15-minute compilation of violations and evidence. He looked at the title he'd given it, Proof. He sat there looking at that word for a long time. Then he deleted it. Then he deleted the folder. Then he deleted the backup. He stood up, walked to the garage, and grabbed a ladder. He climbed it and looked at the camera pointed at the back gate. Then he climbed down, got his tools, and began removing the equipment. It took him 3 hours to remove all 4 cameras, to disconnect the wiring, to erase the stored footage, to take apart the system he'd spent $2,000 on and invested months of his life maintaining. When he was finished, his property was undefended, his violations undocumented, his boundaries unrecorded. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt empty in a way that scared him. He went to bed at 2 a.m. without having eaten dinner. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the Henderson party winding down across the fence, and understood with sudden, nauseating clarity what he'd done. He hadn't just removed the cameras. He'd removed his proof. He'd removed his documentation. He'd removed the tangible evidence that anything had ever violated him at all. The next morning, he called his real estate agent. "I need to sell," he told her. "Quickly, I'll take whatever the market will bear, I just need to be done." "Is everything okay?" she asked. "The property was valued at." "I don't care," he said. "What are comparable properties selling for in this neighborhood right now?" "Around 1.2 million, depending on condition. But your property is in excellent condition. You could get 1.3, maybe even 1.35 if we do proper staging." "Put it on the market as is," he said. "I want it gone in 6 weeks." The listing went up on Monday. By Wednesday, he'd received an offer. It was below asking price, 18 million instead of 1.3, but it was cash and it was clean. He accepted it. By Friday, the paperwork was in process. It took 4 weeks to close. During those 4 weeks, Marcus continued to go to work, continued to come home to a house that no longer felt like his, continued to exist in a state of disconnection from his own life. He didn't look out the windows. He didn't engage with the community. He moved through the house like a ghost, and the house felt like a space he was temporarily visiting rather than a place where he'd ever lived. The Henderson family came over once. He watched from his bedroom window as Victoria rang the doorbell, holding flowers and a bottle of wine. He didn't answer. Eventually, she left the gifts on the doorstep and went back home. The day before the closing, Marcus had a final conversation with Officer Ramirez. She came by because he'd called her, because he had one thing he needed to say before he left. "I was right about all of it," he told her, standing in his mostly empty living room. "About the trespassing, about the violations, about all of it being illegal." "Yes," she said simply, "you were." "That didn't matter." "No," she agreed, "it didn't." "Why not?" he genuinely wanted to know. "Why does being right not matter?" Officer Ramirez was quiet for a moment. "Because the system isn't designed to protect someone who's right. It's designed to manage conflict. And once you're in conflict with connected people, the system stops caring about who's right. It just wants the conflict to go away." "So they win." "They don't lose," Officer Ramirez said. "And in situations like this, not losing is the same as winning." She left. Marcus looked around his empty house. Empty because he'd already moved most of his things out, already begun the process of removing himself from this space that had never been safe for him. The closing happened on a Friday morning. Marcus signed the papers in a real estate office downtown. The new owners were a family from the tech sector, which meant they probably understood security systems and property rights and might install cameras of their own. He hoped they would. He hoped they'd understand that boundaries mattered, that violations should be documented, that systems should work the way they were supposed to. He left the house at 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, with his possessions in a rental truck, and his savings account diminished by the legal fees and repairs and the cost of leaving. As he was pulling away, he saw Victoria Henderson standing in her driveway, watching him leave. She waved. He didn't wave back. He drove out of Oak Ridge Estates without looking in the mirror, and the thing he felt wasn't triumph or vindication or the satisfaction of having finally won. It was the hollow, nauseating feeling of having lost something he could never get back. Not just the house, not just the money, but the belief that being right meant anything at all. 3 months later, Marcus received an email that changed everything. He was living in a rental apartment downtown now, close to his office, far from neighborhoods and HOAs and people who thought everyone's property belonged to them. He'd bought minimalist furniture. He'd painted the walls neutral colors. He'd created a space that could be left without guilt, that required no emotional investment, that existed only as a place to sleep. The email came from a journalist named Sarah Chen at the San Francisco Chronicle. She'd been investigating HOA abuse cases and had come across a pattern. In 4 separate neighborhoods managed by the same company, there were complaints from residents who'd been essentially bullied out of their homes by well-connected community members backed by HOA boards. One of those residents was Marcus Webb. "I'd like to tell your story," Sarah's email said. "I believe what happened to you is part of a larger pattern of abuse. I'd like to expose it." Marcus didn't respond for 2 days, then he called her. Sarah's office was in a building that smelled like ink and ambition. She was younger than he expected, probably early 40s, with gray streaking through her dark hair and the look of someone who'd spent too many years fighting for accountability. "Tell me what happened," she said, and so he did. He told her everything: the pool, the violations, the cameras, the escalation, the vandalism, the lawsuit, the removal of the property from market. Sarah took notes without commenting. When he was finished, she asked one question: "Do you still have any of the camera footage?" "No," Marcus said. "I deleted it all." "Okay," she said, and her tone suggested she'd expected that answer. "But you do have documentation of the costs, the repairs, the legal fees, the vandalism reports. That's a different kind of evidence." "Why does it matter?" Marcus asked. "Even if you report on it, I'm still out the money. I still lost the house. Nothing changes." "Things change," Sarah said, "when people understand that this isn't an isolated incident, when they see that there's a pattern, when they understand that HOA boards are abusing their power and destroying people's lives, and nobody's holding them accountable." Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah investigated. She pulled HOA records. She interviewed other residents who'd had similar experiences. She spoke with lawyers who specialized in HOA law. She looked at the management company that oversaw multiple communities and started finding evidence of deliberate obstruction, retaliation, and abuse of power. The article came out on a Sunday morning, front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. "The Dark Side of Homeowners Associations: How Communities Are Weaponized Against Residents." Marcus wasn't named. Sarah had granted him anonymity, but the details were unmistakably about him. The pool, the cameras, the escalation, the eventual exile. The article sparked something. Within days, other residents started coming forward, people who'd been bullied by their HOAs, people who'd been fined for violations of vague rules, people who'd been essentially forced out of their communities by boards that catered to the whims of well-connected members. The management company started receiving complaints from other communities they managed. Shareholders started asking questions. The state attorney general's office requested records and began an investigation. And then Sarah called Marcus with news. "The Hendersons," she said without preamble. "I've been looking into their financials. Derek Henderson is not actually a significant donor. He's been claiming donations he hasn't made. More than that, they've got a pattern. In the last neighborhood they lived in, something very similar happened. A neighbor who questioned one of their activities was systematically driven out." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "I mean they've done this before," Sarah said. "They move into neighborhoods, they push boundaries, they claim ownership of communal spaces, and when someone pushes back, they use their money and their social capital to destroy that person. You weren't their first victim. You were just the first person organized enough to actually document it." "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," Sarah said, "there's a scandal, an investigation. People are looking at Derek Henderson's business practices. And I found something interesting in the HOA records. They've got evidence of what Victoria and her attorney discussed, which was essentially a coordinated campaign of harassment against you. That's potentially actionable. That potentially constitutes criminal activity." Over the next 3 months, the story grew. The state attorney general filed charges against the HOA management company for abuse of power. The HOA Board of Oak Ridge Estates voted to remove their management contract with the company. Derek Henderson was audited by the IRS for false donation claims. The vandalism campaign that the Hendersons' children had participated in came under police investigation. But the part that actually mattered came in May, when Sarah called Marcus with a final update. "The new owners of your house," she said, "installed security cameras immediately after moving in. Their first week there, they caught something interesting on footage. The Hendersons' oldest son and another teenager entering the property without permission and stealing the brand new outdoor furniture set." "They were stealing?" Marcus asked, stupidly. "They were stealing," Sarah confirmed. "Apparently, your departure left them with the impression that they could take whatever they wanted from your old place. The new owners had them arrested. It's in the system now, juvenile records." Marcus sat with this information, trying to feel something about it. Vindication? Satisfaction? He realized after a moment that all he felt was tired. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "when I was researching this, I found something else. In every case where well-connected people destroyed someone's life through HOA harassment, the moment someone with power, like the police or the press or the state government, actually paid attention, it all fell apart. Not because the system was just, but because the people doing it had been operating in the shadows, knowing that nobody important was watching." "So what's the lesson?" Marcus asked. "The lesson is that they only get away with it if nobody sees it," Sarah said. "The moment someone shines a light on it, the whole thing collapses. The moment evidence becomes public, power doesn't matter as much." "But I didn't go public," Marcus said. "You did. I deleted everything. I ran away." "You did," Sarah acknowledged. "But you also saved me your story, and I chose to see it, and now it's public whether they like it or not." It was June when the Hendersons put their house on the market. The listing price was steep. Maybe they didn't understand that the scandal had made their property worth less, not more. Or maybe they did understand and didn't care. Maybe they were just running like Marcus had run, just to escape the weight of what they'd created. Their house sold eventually, 2 months later, to buyers from out of state at a price significantly below asking. Within weeks of the sale, Derek Henderson's business faced another investigation, this one related to charitable fraud. Apparently, there were other instances of fake donations, other communities where false claims had been made. Marcus didn't follow the details closely. He had his own life to rebuild, but he did read Sarah's follow-up article when it came out. The headline was, "How a Neighbor's Tyranny Led to a Criminal Investigation." Reading it felt strange. Strange to see his experience documented not as evidence he'd collected, but as narrative someone else had told. Strange to have his violation become publicly acknowledged. Strange to have his exile validated not by his own documentation, but by journalistic investigation. He was at his office when Officer Ramirez called him. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that we've reopened the case regarding the vandalism at your former property. The new evidence that's come to light about the Hendersons' pattern of behavior, it suggests that the vandalism campaign was coordinated, which makes it something more than juvenile mischief. We're looking at aggravated harassment charges now." "Okay," Marcus said, not sure how he was supposed to respond to this. "I also want to apologize," Officer Ramirez continued, and her voice was careful. "When you came to me with evidence, I should have treated it more seriously. I let the fact that it was a neighborhood dispute make me treat it as less important than it was. That was a mistake on my part, and I'm sorry for it." After she hung up, Marcus sat at his desk for a long time without doing any work. He'd won, by some measure he'd won. The people who'd violated him were facing consequences. The system that had failed him was being looked at. The darkness of what happened had been brought into the light. But he still didn't have his house. He still didn't have his savings. He still didn't have back the sense of safety and security that he'd built over 3 decades of work. Being right had eventually mattered, but it had only mattered after everything else was gone. It was on a Tuesday, almost a year after he'd left Oak Ridge, that Marcus received an actual letter in the mail. Not an email, but a physical envelope with his apartment address handwritten on it. Inside was a check. It was from the HOA management company's insurance carrier. A settlement, not full compensation for everything he'd lost, nothing could be that, but a significant amount, $250,000. The letter accompanying it explained that in the course of the state investigation, evidence had emerged that the HOA board, backed by the management company, had engaged in retaliatory practices against him that violated fair housing laws. The insurance company was settling the case to avoid further litigation. There was another settlement letter in the envelope, from Derek and Victoria Henderson, settled through their attorney. $100,000 paid by their homeowner's insurance as part of their own settlement with the state's investigation into harassment and abuse. Total $350,000. Marcus looked at the checks for a long time. $350,000 wouldn't give him back his house. It wouldn't restore the year he'd lost to legal battles and emotional exhaustion. It wouldn't erase the experience of having his property violated, his boundaries ignored, his rights trampled by people who believed they were above consequences. But it would pay for a therapist. It would pay for a new house. It would pay for the rebuilding of something approximating the life he'd had before. He deposited the checks the next day. The last thing that happened was unexpected. A full year after leaving Oak Ridge, Marcus received an invitation to a speaking event. The invitation was from a housing rights organization that was using his case as part of their advocacy work about HOA reform. He almost deleted it, but something made him accept. The event was held at a conference center in downtown San Francisco. Maybe 100 people showed up: lawyers, advocacy groups, people who'd been through similar situations, people who were trying to understand how these things happened and how to prevent them. Marcus spoke about what happened to him, not the details about the cameras and the documentation. That part of the story didn't seem important anymore. He spoke about the human experience, what it felt like to be violated on your own property, what it felt like to not be believed, what it felt like to realize that being right wasn't enough. When he finished, there was silence for a moment. Then someone in the audience raised their hand. "Do you ever wish you'd just let them use the pool?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Every single day," he said finally. "But that's the wrong question. The right question is, why should I have had to? Why is it reasonable to expect someone to give up their property rights to keep the peace? Why is being nice more important than being respected?" "So you don't regret fighting back?" she asked. "I regret the escalation," Marcus said. "I regret installing cameras. I regret thinking that documentation would solve the problem. I regret a lot of things. But do I regret refusing to let people use my property without permission? No, I don't regret that. I regret that society made it so expensive to defend that right." After the event, a woman came up to him. She was probably in her 50s, with the kind of tired expression that came from too many legal battles. "I'm going through something similar right now," she said. "With my HOA, I'm wondering if I should fight it or just accept it." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Fight it," he said, "but be prepared for the cost, not just in money but in everything. If you can't afford that cost, and I don't just mean financially, then don't fight. But if you can, if you have the resources and the resilience, then fight. Because giving in to violations just creates more violations, and eventually someone has to say no." 2 years after leaving Oak Ridge, Marcus bought a new house. It was in a different neighborhood without an HOA, on a property where the only boundaries were his own, and whatever laws existed to protect them. He didn't install cameras. He didn't need to anymore. He understood now that surveillance wasn't about documentation or evidence or creating an undeniable record. It was about trying to control what you couldn't control, trying to fix what was fundamentally broken: the relationship between people who didn't respect each other. What mattered wasn't the cameras. What mattered was that when someone violated your boundaries, you said no. And when they continued to violate, you made it public. You didn't try to win through evidence. You tried to win through exposure. That was the real lesson, not that being right mattered, but that being seen mattered, that being public about violations mattered, that the moment something moved from private conflict into public scandal, the power dynamics shifted. It was a strange kind of victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He stood in his new backyard one afternoon, looking at the space where a new pool would be installed, this time without neighbors on the other side of the fence who thought it belonged to them. He thought about Victoria Henderson, probably in another neighborhood by now, probably finding new ways to treat shared spaces as her own. He thought about Officer Ramirez, probably still responding to neighborhood disputes, probably still trying to separate right from reasonable. He thought about all the people in all the neighborhoods who were probably, right now, dealing with HOA violations and boundary problems, and realizing that the system wasn't designed to protect them. He hoped that someone, somewhere, would tell their story to a journalist. He hoped that someone would shine a light on it. He hoped that eventually, enough scandals would emerge that people would stop tolerating these violations, and these HOAs would start actually protecting residents instead of well-connected members. He didn't know if that would happen, but he knew that it could. And sometimes, knowing that something is possible is enough to make it seem like the fight was worth it after all. A final piece of information that didn't come until almost 3 years after Marcus had left Oak Ridge. Sarah Chen called him with it. "I've been doing follow-up reporting," she said, "and I found something that I thought you should know. The Hendersons, they left that neighborhood in San Francisco, but they ended up in another community in the Bay Area, and the same thing happened." "What same thing?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew. "Same pattern. They moved in. They acted like communal spaces were theirs. A new neighbor complained, and then they turned it into a campaign against that neighbor. But this time the neighbor kept documentation. This time he went directly to the press. This time it didn't take nearly as long to expose what was happening." "So they were caught again?" Marcus said. "They were caught again," Sarah confirmed. "And this time there are criminal charges, real ones. Derek's looking at potentially 5 years for fraud charges related to fake donations. Victoria's name is being attached to organized harassment campaigns at multiple properties." "Okay," Marcus said. "The reason I'm telling you this," Sarah continued, "is because I wanted you to know something. What you did by coming forward, by letting me tell your story, by refusing to just disappear quietly, it created a precedent. The next victim in the next neighborhood wasn't as powerless as you were. They had your story to point to. They had evidence that this happened before. They had proof that speaking up works." "Did it?" Marcus asked. "Work, I mean, did coming forward actually change anything for them?" "It did," Sarah said. "They won their case faster. They had better legal representation because the firm recognized the pattern from my reporting. They got settlements without having to escalate as far as you did. And now, because your case exists as documentation, the next person who experiences this is going to have an even easier time proving what's happening." Marcus sat with this information. "So I did matter," he said finally. "You did," Sarah confirmed. "Not in the way you wanted to, not through your cameras and your documentation and your evidence, but through your story, through your willingness to admit that you lost, through your understanding that something systemic was wrong. That mattered." After he hung up, Marcus stood in his new backyard, the one without neighbors who thought they owned it, the one surrounded by high fences and clear boundaries, and understood something that he'd been too hurt to understand before. The victory wasn't in winning against the Hendersons. The victory was in making sure that the next person they tried to destroy had a better chance of surviving it. He'd lost his house and his savings and his sense of safety. But his story had become a weapon against people like the Hendersons. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes losing in a way that exposed the system was better than winning in a way that let the system continue. It wasn't the victory he'd wanted, but it was the victory he'd needed.